Good afternoon and welcome to Education Exchange with myself and Michelle Catterson, who is zooming in from Reigate. Hi, Michelle.
Good morning. Oh, good afternoon. How are you, Christine?
Very good. Did you have a good weekend?
I did. It was really busy, but it was good. I like productive, busy weekends.
So we're really honoured today because we have some cracking speakers today. We're going to talk about leadership and all things about leadership. And we're joined with a number of head teachers from across the country. So what we're going to do, hopefully you know Michelle and I if you've watched our discussion series before, but we're going to just introduce everybody who's taking part today as well. So let's start with Irfan.
Hi there, I'm Irfan Latif and I'm the headmaster at the Royal Hospital School in sunny Suffolk.
Helen.
Hello, I'm Helen Wilkinson and I'm the head at Horace Hill Prep School.
James.
James Worthing, academic principal, Clares Court here in Maidenhead. Not quite so sunny, but happily looking forward to a productive hour with you brilliant colleagues.
Matt.
So Matthew Burke at Bowlia Convent School.
Matt?
We've got two Matts on the phone.
Yes, I forgot. Let's start with Matt Adshade.
Hello, I'm Matthew Adstead, Matt, to all my pals, and I am the proprietor and former long-serving head of the Old Vicarage School in Darley Abbey.
And then Matthew.
Thank you. So Matthew Burke, I'm head at Bowlia Convent School in Jersey.
Pete.
Good morning, everyone. I'm headmaster of Kingham Hill School in the Cotswolds.
Okay. Have I missed any? I don't think I've missed anybody. I've got a list here.
Silas.
Just me, Silas
Silas?
Edmonds. So I'm Silas, principal of York Castle School. So we're a co-ed all through school on the Surrey-London borders.
Okay, so we're going to kick off with the first question. Are we ready? This is a bit like question time. Right, and it's a bit of a free-for-all, so it'll be whoever speaks will come in on the conversation first, and let's see if it works. So the first question is, are great leaders born or made?
Wow, that's a good question, Christine.
You started us off with a paradox already, Christine. I think. I suppose I'd look back on my leadership journey and say a huge amount of it was down to training, mentoring and coaching from others, and just the experience of being in at the deep end and seeing how it goes.
We welcome Ariti as well. So Ariti, I hope you heard that first question. Are leaders born or are they made?
I think a bit of both, to be perfectly honest with you. I think there needs to be something innate within you where you're willing to serve, especially if you believe in servant leadership, which is very much something that I follow. You have to want to do well by other people to be a good leader, and I think that's innate. But the way in which you do that and the way in which it's lived out, I think is something that can be learnt and taught, especially with good mentoring and coaching. You can get better at it.
Okay, James?
I've been a head teacher for 43 years now. And I think the thing I'd say is I agree that there's leadership that comes from what's within. But I think most leaders have to reinvent themselves over time. And I think we take a huge amount of interest and knowledge from working with other people too. So I think I've found collaboration and leadership to be really important for me. And I think the model I now follow is architect leadership as well as servant leadership. That in the end, I know I want to understand how to build the things, which is where the architect bit comes in. I started off, I think, in hero leadership, and that's a long way behind me now.
So James, we'll probably come back to you because I think out of all of us, you're the one with the most experience out of all of us here. So we'll come back to you in a moment. Irfan.
Yes, for me, leadership is about the development of people, and that's our responsibility here as heads, whether we develop our staff or whether we develop our pupils who are in our schools. My leadership journey has been facilitated by modelling good practice by head teachers who have been in those positions and have given me the opportunity to lead, to take on responsibility, and to ensure that I've given a safe space in which to make mistakes. So that psychological safety is important, and I think providing that psychological safety for the next generation of leaders is key. And for me, it was about moving up the ranks, if you like, and getting the necessary experience and being taught how to lead with, making sure your moral compass is pointing in the right direction, and ensuring that any mistakes that I did make, I learned from them and was able to develop from that. But yes, leadership, I agree with colleagues who have already spoken on the topic. There is an innate equality with regards service, and RHS, we've been looking at what values mean at RHS, and at RHS we talk about respect, honour and service, and that service leadership is key to what we do here, and so being coached and mentored as well in how to lead is also very important.
Thank you. Matthew from Old Vicarage. Right, we might have lost Matthew. Let's go to the other Matthew, Matthew Burke.
I think that we all have kind of natural inclinations to play a role, but I think reflecting on what Irfan was just talking about, but also James earlier, I think great leaders, and we're all hopefully great leaders on this call, it's made through a process of self-reflection, and teaching, as we know, is a career where self-reflection stands you in good stead. And I think thinking about values such as communication and empathy and adaptability, we're all very different now as we probably were a year, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 or 40 years ago as a leader, as James mentioned. And that process of learning, of reflecting and honing key leadership skills, I think probably leads me to think that we're made, but those natural inclinations are there for those of us that have gone into leadership roles.
Pete, what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to hear so many people speaking about the impact of coaching and mentoring. As someone who actually retrained as a coach between headships and spent a couple of years doing coaching and mentoring, often of other school leaders. And I personally am of the opinion that every single school leader should be in an active relationship with a coach or a mentor. I think it's so important for all of us. I'm also fascinated by the language we use around leadership. Interesting hearing James speaking earlier about being an architect leader. I've always enjoyed reading. There's a lovely book by Alverson and Spicer called Metaphors We Lead By, which I often dip back into. There were some really interesting ideas in there about how we conceive of our own leadership using metaphors such as being a gardener or being a cyborg or being a commander. It's a challenging read, but I think it's a really interesting book.
Thank you. Helen?
I'm just wondering if I'm a cyborg leader. I want to read more about that. Sounds very interesting. So yeah, I think that it's fair to say that here at Horace Hill and prep schools and schools across the country, we can probably point out the pupils that we think are going to be leaders in the future, but they may not necessarily go on to be so. And I think you have to want to be a leader in order to make it work properly. And I certainly think that, 30 years ago when I first started in education, it took all my courage to stand in front of a class, let alone a theatre full of 2,000 parents with colleagues in it as well. So it's something that you learn, it's something that you gradually become more confident with, I think, over time. And I think you're absolutely right. Having good mentors, good leaders, good role models throughout your career really helps you. And I think if we're fortunate enough to work with great leaders, then it produces great leaders going forward. So that's a big responsibility on all of us, I'm sure. And I think it's important as well when you're a leader that you're not only willing to challenge people to sharpen their practice, but also that you're willing to be challenged, because that does happen as well. And I think those are two aspects of leadership that I think we all learn as we go. So that develops resilience in us, and also in our young people as well. Developing their leadership skills is very much part of what's important. Public speaking as well as a leader isn't something that everybody takes to naturally, and I think that's something that you learn to do more effectively as you kind of grasp the nettle more and more. So yeah, I think it's important as well. I think probably the most natural or the most important thing about leadership is developing trust. with your team. And for us as educators, with the pupils, obviously, and the families with which we interact. So that, again, is very important to an aspect of leadership, which I think you can't really learn. It's more sort of emotional intelligence, which you kind of gather as you've been doing the role for a long time.
Thank you. Matthew, were you there? Vicarage, Matthew?
Hello. Sorry. Yes, I need some leadership in technology, obviously. Now, I think everybody said everything that I want to say, really. I think I just echo the necessity now for coaching and mentoring, and also I've been a lifelong supporter and an attempted advocate of servant leadership. I think, and particularly now in this day and age with Gen Alpha and Gen Z, I think there is no other way. They don't follow the Brian Clough or the Alex Ferguson way. They're very much Jurgen Klopp these days. So I think it's the hairdryer system is gone, and it's servant leadership all the way. But yeah.
Thank you, Matthew. Back to you, Michelle, to pick up the conversation.
So my journey into leadership in education was a bit of a sink or swim moment. So things weren't great at the school. I just joined as deputy head. I'd done a term, and then in the summer, the senior leadership didn't return. So I was a very sort of wet behind the ears deputy head, trying to sort of learn how to be a leader, and was just sort of chucked in at the deep end. So I had to figure it out, and figure it out quickly. Thankfully, I had a really supportive staff. I think one of the qualities that is really undervalued in leadership is empathy. And I think I have been accused in the past. So I had a governor once that said, "You're just too nice. You need to be a little bit tougher." And it really grated on me, because obviously they did not value empathy and kindness as much as I do. But I think empathy in a leader, the ability to understand, to listen to someone else's perspective, their opinion, and put yourself in their position, I think has stood me in really good stead over the years. I am always willing to put my hands up and say, yeah, didn't do that right, dropped the ball, or learn from others. And I think you can learn a lot from your colleagues as well, not just other leaders, and how other colleagues approach situations. My sort of style of leadership is very collaborative. It's listening to my senior leadership team, my middle managers, my teaching assistants, anybody in the school, because they have a different perspective on things to what I do. And they maybe have different insights. So can you be taught how to be a good leader? Yes, absolutely. But I do think there needs to be that core of willingness, that you have certain skills in order to, I think, get people along with you on the journey. So for me, when the school wasn't performing the way I wanted it to, we had loads of changes to implement and to put in place. It was really difficult for some staff, because it was so different to what they had known and how things had been previously. So it's gaining that trust in those colleagues round about you to come on that journey with you, and to see the vision and where it is that you want to eventually be. So yeah, for me, it was a bit of both. A bit of did I have the skill set in me? Perhaps at the time I didn't. I really struggled with imposter syndrome and feeling that I wasn't doing the right things. But I think with a reflective perspective and looking back, I did have the basic cores of a good leader, even though I might not have been aware of it myself at the time. And a lot of the rest of it has come through my esteemed colleagues that are on this call with me, looking at what other people are doing, and pinching ideas from different places to try and create the type of leader that you want to be.
I think also coming together, and our discussions that we have when we do get to meet face to face, are so valuable as well. And I think, leadership and the skills that we have to have are developed over time. And it leads into, going back to the pandemic. Just to set a bit of background what happened here, we had a ski party that travelled through northern Italy in February half term of 2020, and when they arrived we had public health telling us that we had to send them home, and this is before it all really kicked off. And I remember that feeling inside of me when I had the children in the Learning Resource Centre saying to them, and those children in 11 and 13, "You've got to go home. inner conflict I was feeling was because we'd never done this before, was probably quite a defining moment, I think, and a turning point in my own leadership. So I'm going to throw the questions open to the panel now, and I'm going to work down, because it's actually easier if I call you in rather than just coming in. Is what did you learn from the pandemic in your leadership? What were your struggles, and what did you find came through innately during that time? And we'll start with Irfan.
Thank you, Christine. Yes, it was a challenging time for us all. You know, I'd always said I'll write a book about how to run a school from the kitchen table. It was difficult, but what I learned a lot about myself was patience, because and how to change that rhythm of leadership that we had. We as head teachers know what's coming up. We plan, you know, we plan 2-3 years in advance. We've got a strategic plan. We know this is going to be put in place. We were living by the hour. We were waiting for the BSA or whoever to send through directives to say, right, this is the next step. This is what you've got to do. And so it was really, really difficult. But what we did find is that people came together. We gave them the opportunity to lead and give them the responsibility to look at their various areas within those sort of COVID restrictions that they had, and allowed them to move on. Like many of the leaders sat around here today, you know, when that call came in on March the 18th, by March the 20th, we were all online. We had already put in various steps and strategies and interventions to ensure that we could make that switch straight away, provided the necessary inset and training for our staff so that they could seamlessly move online in order to make sure that there was business continuity, and that the pupils and parents were happy with what we were doing. It wasn't easy. It wasn't easy making sure that the tech was all in place, etc. Especially me being in central London before I joined RHS. I was at DLD College London. We literally just had to zip up the whole school, the boarding house, and even I wasn't even let in. So running everything from the kitchen table was a challenge in itself, because you just wanted to go out and I know you couldn't, put an arm around people and say, look, it's going to be okay. But, you know, that metaphorical virtual arm around everyone, checking in on everyone every day, the house parents, the cleaning staff, the catering staff who were there, who were living in the building at the time, because we didn't furlough anyone. We had about 160 odd students who needed to be looked after because they couldn't go home, because flights were grounded, borders had closed, etc. So we really did learn a lot about each other. You know, Saturdays and Sundays were out the window. We were just making sure, checking in that everyone was okay, both online and at school. So it was tough, but we learned a lot about each other. And I think we grew together as a team, and we were able to move forward with some of the things that we wanted to do in terms of strategy post-COVID. So although many say it was a very challenging and difficult time, I found it quite a time for us to come together and just see what needed to be done. And it was a light bulb moment for many of us in terms of what does leadership really mean.
Thank you. Silas, over to you.
Well, I just wholeheartedly agree with what Irfan just said there. I think for me, the sense of team was palpable. As soon as the bad news hit, it was about gathering people around, getting everyone to play to their strengths. Obviously, we had to have that central control and that sense of strategy about what we were doing. But it was like building little teams of people and allowing them to go off and do what we needed them to do. So as well as all the online stuff, it was really about how we arranged the care for the key workers. We had nearly 50 children in every day throughout the pandemic, and there was a team of us in school looking after them, and staff came in on rotas, and the goodwill was extraordinary. And I'll always look back on that time, as difficult as it was, and think about how we couldn't have done it just on our own. Leaders have to have good people around them, and they have to be experts at building and nurturing growing teams. I think from an individual experience as a leader, resilience was absolutely key, because there was extraordinary emotional pressure, particularly from our parents, because they were scared. And when people are scared, it's like a crucible. The heat comes on, the impurities rise to the top, and you have to deal with them. And I think those colleagues around me who were able to maintain their resilience and an even temperament were absolutely invaluable in that situation. So those would be my reflections, I think.
Thank you. Ariti.
So I took over as head in the middle of the pandemic. So first headship and COVID went hand in hand. And I know I won't be the only one, but it certainly probably made a first headship more challenging. I think it was a good lesson in the fact that the reality is that leadership is sometimes messy, and that's okay. You're never going to please everybody, and for someone who aims to do that naturally, actually that was a hard lesson for me, and I needed to learn through that to make sure that I looked after myself, because without looking after myself, I couldn't look after my team. I was really very fortunate because I live in school, and so the staff that live in school were able to form a community around looking after key worker children. And the relationships that developed from that were particularly strong, and we can still see the advantages of those today. I learned that it was fine to say that you've made a mistake, or that you were changing your mind sometimes because the government had made a mistake and they were addressing their policy, and therefore you had to change yours. But regardless of what's going on in the background, you really just learn to put on that really calm facade with everyone else. And so for a new leader coming in, learning all of that at the same time, although, as we said before, a lot of it is innate, it does have to be learned. Relying on your colleagues, the importance of delegation, all the things that you read about that good leaders need to do. I think we had an opportunity to really show over the pandemic. But absolutely agree with everything else we've heard. It wouldn't have been possible without the community and the collaboration of the wider community, and not being afraid to innovate sometimes. Jill Berry talks about making the leap to headship, but I think actually you can take that and apply it to pretty much everything. Sometimes you actually just need to go for it, and we did that quite a lot during COVID. We couldn't plan for everything, and I think that there were lots of positive lessons to be learned from that.
Thank you. Matthew Burke.
I think one of the things that I learned is actually evidence in what we are doing now, and that we came together as heads, and it didn't matter whether we were in the same area, it didn't matter whether we were in the same association. We genuinely wanted to support one another and come together. And from a personal point of view, I learned to be much more adaptable, I think, in terms of leadership. And up until then, crisis management had literally been in theory, but it needed to be put into practice and bring the team along with you. Like Aretti started that headship as COVID broke. I was at St Edward's, Cheltenham, then, so not a million miles away from where Peter's now, and it was strange to be joining a community at that time. Strange to be not meeting all your staff face to face and all the students and pupils face to face, but actually we got through it, and that's the point, isn't it? We came out stronger. We were able to be a bit more flexible, a bit more adaptive, and I think there are probably models around our flexible work policies now that wouldn't have come out of it, but for that. And I think, we talked about it a lot when we were coming out. Those silver linings are what we've hopefully grabbed hold of and run with ever since. That it was challenging times. It was really, really tough, but our teams came together. We came together. Our schools did really well, and that was the important thing for me.
Thank you. Helen.
Yeah, I think I'd echo an awful lot of what's been said already. I think it is very difficult. It was a very difficult time for everyone. I actually ran stupidly moved schools mid-pandemic, so ended up running in two different locations. But I think what it taught me more than anything else was just how amazing our profession is, how incredible our colleagues are, how flexible they are, how creative they are, and how much they care. And although we knew that already before the pandemic, I think it just highlighted all of those aspects, really, really brought them to the fore. And it upsets me a little bit, actually, that as a profession, I don't think we've really got the recognition for that. And I think that our colleagues deserve a huge amount of their ability to just cope. And of course, it requires somebody at the helm who's just willing to make decisions. And like you said as well, Aretti, I think sometimes you just have to make decisions with the information that you have in front of you at the time and accept the fact that sometimes it might be wrong. but a decision has to be made, and it needs to be made with a smile on your face and a swan-like disposition, and you just kind of get on with it, really. And it may well be that a few days later or a few weeks later, you go, crikey, that didn't get that right. But I think also the willingness to hold your hands up and admit that to your team and say, okay, with the information that we had right then, that was the right decision to make. However, we're reassessing things, we're looking at things again, and this is what we're going to do moving forwards. And I think having the humility as a leader to hold your hands up to that, I think is really important.
Thank you. Pete?
I don't have much to add here, Christine, because I was actually between my headships during the pandemic, but I was actively pursuing my coaching qualification, and to get to my sort of 60-hour minimum that I needed to get to, I was working with a number of school leaders, so was acutely aware of the pressures they were feeling. And yeah, as Helen has just said, that the recognition of how hard everybody worked and how quickly people pivoted to go online, and all of the wonderful things that schools did. It was a privilege to be there just as somebody that could listen to the stresses and strains that other heads were facing, even though I wasn't actually facing them myself. So I feel a bit of a fraud on that one, so nothing else to add.
Not at all. It's a spot on with the coaching bit and listening to people, and that's a big part of how we survive. James Wilding, over to you.
Clarity of judgment and decision making seems to me to be coming through in what colleagues are saying, and of course, with 4 head teachers working underneath me, I had to kind of work out how to keep that in sync. And Michelle, you're right. The currency of kindness was the way forward. The lessons I think that I learned that I remember vividly most were, after the age of 11, any child appearing on screen had to have their icon and wouldn't show their face unless they were actually being spoken to. Never knew that was a thing till the pandemic. Giving people back their childhood, really important part of what we've done now. So every one of our break times is always at least 20 minutes long, so that children can come together and just have a childhood. And our contribution as a sector to how UK education was able to survive, I don't think has ever been given the full credit it should have been. The final thing I think that we must remember is that so many of the people that made the school work weren't the teachers. They were all the other people making sure that the school, as we've heard from the community, the kids who had to come in, the key workers, children had to be looked after. We had to keep everything going. And the fact that we had so few staff on furlough was a tribute to those staff being willing to not take risks, but just to recognise they had a part to play. You know the story, don't you, of the cleaner at Cape Canaveral when asked at NASA what his job was. His job was, my job is to put a man on the moon. And I think that's what all the time I think about. What's my job? My job is to be able to work for the kids, to help them be the best they can be. And that came through very clearly in the pandemic from the contribution that parents made as well. If we ever said to parents, look, help us do this practical work, we had dads in the kitchen with their boys and girls helping do those food tech lessons. Just a great opportunity. We were all there to make sure that education continued.
Fantastic. And Matt, the other Matt.
Hi, yes. James, everything that everyone else has said, of course, I agree with, and experience. The 2 areas I was going to mention one was those ancillary staff who put themselves on the line without any fear, and all for the children. The other key area for me, I suppose, in my leadership style and in the change of mindset, was how I viewed parents. All my career had been about children, staff, then parents. I'd always put things in that order. My view was, if the children are happy and I've got a great staff team, by rights, the parents should get on with it, and should be happy, and should be there what they want. Faced with such fear and uncertainty and existential crisis, I very quickly changed mindset and worked out fast, what do these parents really need? What do they need at the moment from us? And how can we deliver it? And that has been at the very forefront of all of my thinking ever since. Of course, we still put children first, but parents and how I view them and how I value them and how I put myself in their place daily in what we do, I think is the biggest way I've changed leadership since the pandemic.
Yeah, I really agree with you there, because it was a case of, it was the parents were at the forefront of everything, wasn't it, during that pandemic as well. We as adults had to stick together to find the path through for the children. So with that, I'm going to throw a question into the mix straight back at Michelle as my co-host. So there's a lot about vulnerability. Now, we as leaders have to have we have to have the answers. But in an age of AI now and where things are going, there is that uncertainty that we can't actually tell our young people what is going to happen. That makes me feel quite vulnerable in a way, and vulnerability is supposed to be seen now as quite an asset in leadership. Michelle, what about vulnerability? What do you think about that?
Gosh, it's really difficult, isn't it? I suppose there are times where it's good to show vulnerability. It's definitely, like I mentioned in my previous response, times where you hold your hands up and you go, do you know what? I don't know the answer. I'll need to find that out for you. There's definitely times where that's beneficial to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. But I also think as well, there's a lot of times where your staff, your parents, your students look to you for the answers. They look to you for the answers, for reassurance, and to make them think that they're making the right choices. So being vulnerable, I think, is being true, it's being honest, and absolutely, where appropriate, you should show vulnerability. I don't think you lose any credibility as a leader to show your vulnerability. But it's definitely a situation where you have to judge if it's appropriate to be vulnerable or not. It's like those situations where you want to connect with a student, how a student's feeling, but it's really important not to share how you've experienced something really similar, because it kind of takes away from what it is that they're trying to tell you. So it's kind of with experience. And yeah, there's been times where I've been in situations with parents, specifically at the start of my headship, where instead of being vulnerable and perhaps not saying that I don't know the answer, you almost feel that you've got to defend your position. And now, as a leader, with the years of experience that I've had, I realise that that's wrong, that it's not necessary to be defensive and to defend your position all of the time. Of course, there are times where you feel it is important and you've got to stand up for what you think is right and in the best interest of your school. But there are lots of conversations that even now, because I'm a bit of an overthinker, that I reflect on, that I've gone past, and there's no way I'll meet those parents again or that conversation will arise again. But I wish I could have done things differently. And as they say, obviously hindsight's a wonderful thing. But yeah, being vulnerable is important. Being vulnerable is key. But there needs to be strength within leadership as well. And as we've spoken about, all those sort of difficult decisions during COVID where nobody was telling us what to do. We kind of had to figure it out ourselves and make the right decisions that we thought were right and the best thing to do at that time. But just to kind of tie up the whole COVID thing, aside from the sort of obviously negative side of things and how awful it was for people to lose family members and to go through all those stresses, as a leader, I felt really purposeful. I felt like I had a really important job to do to keep things as normal as possible for those members of staff that might have been worried, that might have been scared, for those children that might have had mum or dad that was working for the NHS or frontline staff. So I think those are the times where you maybe don't want to show vulnerability. You sympathise, you empathise, you understand, but you need to show sort of strength of character as well.
And I suppose that we're coming on to paradoxical leadership as well. So as we go round again, we start the question, we're going to look at vulnerability, but also how can paradoxical leadership help schools navigate uncertainty? Okay, so we're looking at that leadership, vulnerability, paradoxical leadership. Irfan, we start with you, right in the hot seat.
Well, I suppose you just need to, as Michelle said, it's that reflective perspective. It's about looking at what are you doing and ensuring that it meets the needs of everyone in your community. You're not going to be able to satisfy everybody, but if you are authentic, and I think that is key here. And Michelle talked about being authentic and being consistent in your decision making. People are then going to have that trust in your leadership. And you'll bring people along with you in terms of what you want to achieve for the school and for your staff and for the community as a whole. And so, yes, it is important to be authentic, but at the same time, it is important that you make the decisions which you believe in your heart is going to be the right decisions for the school, in terms of curriculum, in terms of pastoral care, in terms of boarding, in terms of finance, all those sort of things. But you do have experts that you rely on, that you lean on, in order for them to provide you with the right advice, so that you can then go on to make the right decision going forward to ensure the future-proofing and sustainability of the school. So that paradox leadership is there is a fine line there, but I always go back, and this is when I started on my sort of leadership journey. I always go back and say, what is leadership about? And for me, it's that quote by the industrialist Harvey Firestone. It's the growth and development is the highest calling of leadership. That for me is key about what we're doing here as leaders. It's not a status symbol. It's not, the plaque on the wall or the space in the car park. That for me, I don't care about any of that. It's about what am I doing in my school, my establishment, in my workplace, in order to remove those barriers which will allow people to grow and develop. If there are those barriers, what is there? And you go back to what Peter was saying. Coaching and mentoring is key now in our schools. We adopted that back at DLD. We're now adopting this at RHS, so that people can have those constructive conversations and provide that psychological safety, so that we build a culture around that, so that people can make mistakes and they're not going to be judged. They're not going to be castigated. In fact, they're going to learn from those. And we say it's okay to do that. So yes, that growth and development of people for me is at the heart of what we are doing here at schools.
Thank you. Areti?
Yes, I think I'd agree with Irfan, and particularly the idea of being authentic in your decision making. It's quite hard to show a balance between confidence and humility, between control and empowerment, between being task orientated, especially when you have to get something done in COVID, and people orientated. So all of those things are they require different skill sets, and you have to know, I think as Michelle mentioned earlier, you have to read the room a little bit, and you have to know when to show what aspect of your leadership style. When do you come across with confidence? When do you come across with humility? And if you use your authentic self, if you really are authentic, honest in what you're doing, if you have integrity in what you do, I think that you can overcome most of those challenges. It is an opportunity to build trust. I think being authentic really does help to build trust, and it encourages communication to be open. And education is full of really complex challenges, isn't it? And trying to balance that and the paradoxes that we come across is key to what we do. So no one answer, I think. And for me, it's about reading the situation that you're in at a particular time. When are you divisive? When are you very open? When do you do short-term planning? When do you do long-term thinking? Especially with some schools now with AI, as you mentioned earlier, what part of tradition do we hold on to? How do we hold on to tradition while still being innovative? All of those are things that I think all of us are tackling every day. And going back again to that authenticity that Irfan mentioned, I think is the answer for me.
Helen?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that's been said so far, and the word authenticity seems to be ringing with everybody, and I completely agree. In fact, I remember many years ago sitting one of those tests that tell you what colour hat that you're supposed to wear, and I was told that I needed to wear my slippers at work more often, which I found a slightly odd comment. But I think one slipper and one high heel, I think, is probably the way that I would describe my approach to leadership. I think it's important that your team feel comfortable around you, but not so comfortable they become complacent. I think it's important that they can challenge you. I use the GCHQ method, that being able to be challenged with noble intent. As long as you are challenging me because you want to put the pupil and the school's interest first, then challenge away, but don't just come in for a whinge. Let's challenge each other behind closed doors, and let's get out there and smile and show a united face. I'm sure we all have the same approach. But I think, there is a paradox as well. Sometimes I feel like I'm spinning plates. Sometimes I feel like I'm smashing crabs. at the background because there are just jobs that need to be done. So there's a paradox there, I guess, to an extent. And I think a lot of what we're talking about together collectively as well, sort of is that inverted pyramid of leadership, which has been around for a while now, that servant leadership model that everybody's been referring to. Sometimes it's important to lead from the front, sometimes from the middle, sometimes from the side or behind, but you choose the right way depending on the context, as some of you have already alluded to. And that goes back to that emotional intelligence that you develop as a leader, knowing when it's the right time to dial up and dial down. And when you let your team run with things, and when you actually rein it in a little bit and become more strategic in things. But I think one of the key things for me, I think as a leader in amongst all this is knowing how to remove barriers for people so that they can actually be better at what they do themselves. And I think the biggest compliment I've had recently is somebody coming in and saying, I feel that since you've arrived, I go home feeling like I've achieved something every day. Because they've had barriers removed, they've had the empowerment to be able to take control a little bit more of themselves. And I think that's what leadership is empowering other people to do a better version of their job as well. So yeah, and it is paradoxical because you have to wear different coloured hats depending on the situation you're in, and the people that you're dealing with, and you have to learn very quickly how your team best responds to you. Some members of your team will respond to encouragement, praise. Other people just don't want to hear it. They just really want to be told directly, let me know, tell me what I need to do and I'll do it. And some people just want to be left to work that out for themselves and just have you say thank you afterwards. So it's learning your team as well. I think that's really important, and not just taking it all on your shoulders, because it's exhausting when you do that.
Absolutely. And I know, Silas, you call me the Duchess, but I'm now going to call James Wilding the godfather of headship. Okay, because James, you've been in a long time. Have you had to see more paradoxical kind of leadership? What changes have you seen, and where? Is this more significant now? Are we seeing more changes now?
Well, I can answer that in two ways. I'll try it with my way first, which is that education goes back at least 7,000 years. And when we look at classrooms in ancient Assyria, they're round about the size of 20 to 22 people in them, including the teacher. And it couldn't have been simpler then, because the teacher knew the children had to make their mark in clay. Now in 21st century, we absolutely know that education is the most complex business in the world, as a consequence to which we need to understand that how do we make it simple? And I love Helen's comment she's made, is that we remove barriers. That's the thing I think is so clear for us to understand, that the creativity of the human has been there forever. You think about the stories we know from 7,000 years ago, extraordinary, complex, idiosyncratic. And that's actually where our schools are. They're extraordinary, complex, idiosyncratic places. And those teachers that we're working with could easily be both autistic and also the most amazing communicators. It's so hard to know how to lead a community that is so diverse. And we do that because we understand our job is to make something that seems complex simple. We're here for the children. I love Matthew's comment. We are here for the parents, and we're here for the staff. And that's a paradox we actually balance out. We're here for all those three parts. And of course, a bit of it for ourselves, for that sense of reward we get when, as people turn around as they do and say, thank you, you helped my work and helped me achieve something today. The bit that's now becoming really difficult is the deliberate assault from outside that actually, for me, is really raging at the heart of what we do, when for the first time in my career, I've seen a national government genuinely seek out, without animosity, to damage us. And that for me is why I'm so actively now working as a leader, as best I can, working with you and Michelle and others in this group to really help people understand it is about education we exist for. We're here for the children, and please don't damage us. English education is at the heart of the world triumph, and we should be kept there rather than put into some kind of tax backwater. Such a real problem for us as we look forward, with some anxiety over the next few weeks and months, as we help our own staff and parents prepare for what could be complex for them in the time ahead.
Thank you, James. Over to you, Matthew Burke.
I was just reflecting on Michelle's talk about her comments around vulnerability, and I think it's it's important as leaders that we see ourselves as role models for all members of our community. And that's colleagues, that's other leaders, but that's also the parents and the children. And so those values that we talk about, and vulnerability might be one, that we encourage our students, don't we, to leave themselves open, to put themselves in challenging situations. We need to model ourselves, but there's a time and place for that. I think the interesting thing for me, you talked about paradoxical leadership, is what I really like is the fact that it embraces contradictions. And I think actually the situation that James just described, the situations that we find ourselves in at the moment, allow us in uncertain times to have multiple perspectives to coexist. And I think we have a challenge at the moment in our schools to balance stability, but we also need to be innovative. And we talked, didn't we, about individual autonomy, but also collective goals for our schools. And the beauty of that idea of paradoxical leadership is that those things can coexist, those things can come together, and they're not necessarily seen as a threat. I think all of us within our senior teams will have different leaders, and we need that in a team. We need to have those that will think differently. We need to have those that will challenge appropriately, those that will say, actually, Matthew, that was an absolutely shocking idea, and why would you think about doing that here? And having that honesty and the ability to have those conversations with our senior team is really important. So having those different thoughts, being able to come together and enable a school, a community, a group of schools to thrive is really important. But that I'm really, really keen to talk about that and stress that idea of us being role models. We have, I think it's important for us that, we have it within our grasp for the future leaders of the schools. I think, I've been ahead for 13, 14 years now. 4 of my deputies have gone on to headship. And I think that's really important, that we, in the way that we go about our job as heads, we are inspiring others to want to do that rather than put them off. And I think having that flexibility within our leadership group to see that different people can take on that roles and make the role for themselves is really important. The way I am a head is because of heads that I had as a student, but also those that I've worked under at various points in my teaching career. That doesn't mean that I'm not my authentic self, but it does mean that I've picked up bits and pieces from how they've handled scenarios or situations to become hopefully a better leader. And I'd say I'm a better head today than I was yesterday. And next week I'll be a better head than I am today because of the experiences that I have.
Thank you. Just to add to the conversation before we continue as well, because Michelle's put a quote in on the chat as well, and that quote is actually from Blair Shepherd from PwC. He's the head of global strategy and leadership, and it was following a post I put out when I'd been into the Round Square International Conference in London, where we were talking about paradoxical leadership, that I found Blair's 6 pillars of paradoxical leadership for PwC, and I tagged him in the post, and the next morning I had a message from him, and I think this was when my imposter syndrome and my vulnerability came out, because I thought, oh, he's going to tell me off for tagging him in a post, but he didn't. He reached out, and we met online. He's in the US. We met online for an hour to discuss this and this quote where and this is on PwC website. So if leaders around the world want a better future for our children and grandchildren, they need to find within themselves the capacity to navigate the 6 paradoxes or surround themselves with people who can. The stakes are simply too high for them not to. So we're going to pick up the conversation now, Pete. And we're going to carry on about the vulnerability, paradoxical leadership, maybe that quote you've just heard. So over to you, Pete.
Yeah, thank you. Talking of quotes, I have one in mind actually in this discussion around both paradoxical leadership and vulnerable leadership. There's a lovely quote that Lewis Carroll puts in the mouth of Humpty Dumpty in Through the Looking Glass. Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, it means exactly what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. And I think there's an element of that around some of these words and what do we actually mean by them. I'm not sure I've yet to see the concept of paradoxical leadership articulated clearly in a Western context, because it's coming out of an Eastern tradition, an Eastern philosophical background. But I think it's an interesting thing to explore. For me, it's really about us as heads saying, well, it's not as simple as either or now. It's both and. But haven't we always done that? Isn't that something we've always been doing? But anyway, that's an interesting discussion. Going back to the thoughts have been shared on vulnerability. I think that is a crucial thing. But what do we mean by vulnerability? And I think, again, it means being open. And I think, to repeat the word that many of you have used already, it's about being authentic, isn't it? And authentic as a leader. I think also for me, and this is a massive challenge for me because this is not how my head is wired, being vulnerable means being comfortable with uncertainty. And I am very uncomfortable with uncertainty. I find that a major challenge for myself personally as a leader. But I think that's a key element of vulnerability. Yeah, thank you.
That's really interesting. I think we probably all feel the same way too, actually. Silas, over to you.
Yeah, when I was first considering this and just listening to what everyone said, surely everything about school leadership is paradoxical. And I wonder whether that's why it's resonated so much for all of us when we've been sort of thinking about it and discussing it. It put me in mind of Jim Collins' Good to Great. He talks about the paradoxical blend of personal humility and professional will, that leaders have to be ambitious first and foremost for their schools, in our instance, not for themselves. But I did have a look at Blair Shepherd's, one of his articles on the PwC website, and his definition was paradoxical leaders navigate tensions that can offer creative friction, that can empower and free, or paralyze and constrain. And again, it's trying to hold those different elements in tension, almost like a continuum, that you're trying to keep that balance, that optimal balance all the way through, which is so important. I haven't been able yet to read Stephen Pullman's book, which is called Paradoxes Leadership, but and I've read a review of it, and it talks about how he builds on the work of Blair Shepherd. So I guess for anyone tuning in, Blair Shepherd's a great starting point, but maybe Stephen Pullman's might take you further on down the track. So I need to check out his book, as some folks on the panel may already have done so. Yeah, but just to summarize, I think everything that we do as school leaders is paradoxical leadership.
Thank you. Matthew, other Matthew.
Fascinating stuff to listen to, really, colleagues, really fascinating. I go back to my first experience of leadership in 2002. I was Deputy Headmaster of St John's Beaumont. I was a very young man at 29. And James, and I think perhaps you, Christine, might remember my first late great mentor, Dermot Gogarty, who was my head teacher, who died in service 2005, leaving behind 5 children, the youngest of who was 8. So talking about crises and learning at the sharp end, that was a big moment for me in my career. And moving forward, that vulnerability at that time taught me a great deal. It taught me that we don't always have that luxury of losing our temper, or the luxury of crying in public. But then you think to yourself, well, we're only human after all. As the great and mighty Level 42 say in their best song ever written, Something About You. Those things are very important. The human touch, the humanity that we must display, those for me are enormously important. And then moving on from there, as a young family, moving up to a completely new area that we knew no one at all, to become the proprietors of the old vicarage, we were utterly vulnerable. We'd put our whole lives on the line to take this step to become proprietors and to fulfill my dream, really. But Jenny, with as Bursa together, hugely vulnerable at that stage. And the OVS school, as it is now, didn't have a motto at the time. And I couldn't think of one until about 5 or 6 years into the job. And I think it resonates now. And the motto is, I'm a classicist, so forgive me if you're not, Ingenium ac benevolentia. And that means character and kindness. And that's how I try and live my leadership experience, and how I actually it means everything for me about what teaching is. Character and kindness, get those two right, and you're not going to fall short. And one of my greatest advisors, funny enough, as a chap of 34, taking over the proprietorship of a school and suddenly having to work out what it all means, and becoming an expert in employment law, and what's this bit about business rates, Jen? And, oh, we're not a charitable trust. Oh, so, all right. And learning those things on the job and on the hoof. One of my greatest advisors at the time was my father. And he was in business in London. He was the longest serving board director at Sainsbury's before his retirement. He ran the pension fund for Seagrow, for Bart's Hospital Chair. He was running the pension fund for Vodafone and Sainsbury's in his retirement. He's quite a guy. Got his CBE for leading the committee under Major's government, which brought in NVQs and GNVQs and all that kind of stuff. So he knows a bit of stuff, my old man, you know. So I used to lean on him quite a lot, and he said, Matt, just keep it simple. Just keep trying to make it the best school it can possibly be. That's it.
And that's really lovely. And that leads on to the last question, because I know we're running out of time now. So it'll be a one sentence each as we go round. My question to you is, how should leadership evolve, or does it need to evolve to meet the challenges of the next decade? Irfan.
Thank you. Back in the hot seat again. Be yourself. That's all I can say. Be yourself. As Matt said, character and kindness, if we can develop those, that's going to put us in a really good place.
Areti.
Areti's had to leave the call.
Michelle, we're with you then. Go on, you can ask this one.
Gosh, it's just willingness to take a risk, to make mistakes, that you're not going to get everything right, and that's okay. I want that from my students. I want it from my staff, so I've got to demonstrate it as a leader.
Helen.
I think just being dynamic, agile, flexible, and demonstrating to your students and allowing them to make mistakes and to just reflect on the mistakes and brush them off. Because that's what's going to make them stand out from technology in the future, that ability to be creative, that ability to just try something a little bit outside the box, and to celebrate those moments when perhaps they do maybe make a little mistake and then they pick themselves up and move on. I think that's going to be key moving forwards.
James.
I'd go for ownership. Us proprietors would always use the best adjective we could think of to describe our school, brackets, mine.
Matthew Burke.
I think in terms of evolving, I think we need to be more inclusive. I think we need to be more adaptable. But I think part of that also hopefully is leading us to have a focus on long-term sustainability, not just for our schools, but for our sector.
Pete.
Act with integrity and make sure your governing body are paying for you to have the support of a coach or a mentor.
Silas.
Remind yourself of why you wanted to be a school leader in the first place, and keep on reinterpreting what that looks and feels like in your current role.
Matthew, anything to add?
I've mentioned Dad, I'm going to mention Mum now. Whenever bringing up the family, it got stressful. I used to ask her for advice. And she said, very simple with children, Matty. Love them, love them, love them. It's the same with your parents, your staff, and above all those kids in your care.
And I think what I'll add to that, you've all said it all, but I want to thank you all, because I think what we have today and what we've delivered here and the support we give each other is so special now and so incredibly needed, that the leaders of the future need to maintain these relationships throughout our sector. Michelle, anything you want to say before we go?
Christine, why did you become a head teacher?
I didn't intend to. It's something I never thought I'd do. Life took me that way. Sometimes the winds of life take you in directions you never knew, but it was one of the best winds that I ever caught on. It's taken me to this wonderful world of leadership. So I think, thank you everyone. We're coming to the end of the session.
Sorry, Christine, I'm really sorry to butt in, but it has to be said. I know there's a number of other people around the table who are doing great stuff, but thank you for all you're doing for the sector.
Yeah,
oh,
agreed.
thank you. I'm going to get emotional now, so it's time for lunch. So, but we're back. Michelle and I are back actually next Monday, because we're going to talk about governance, and we've got a panel of governors. So I really enjoyed these discussions, guys. Thank you so much, and I look forward to. And we've got a few association conferences coming up, and we can get together and talk in person. But this is so valuable. All right, thank you again, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, everyone.